Here we go. One step at a time, don't be living on the line.
Today's video lesson is going to be all about demand. In addition to defining the economic concept of demand, we're going to discuss the law of demand and draw our first demand curve diagram. Let's begin by discussing what is meant by demand. In a previous lesson, we had a look at the circular flow of income in a nation, in which there were two markets, product markets and resource markets. Anytime a market exists, there are buyers and sellers. The buyers of a good or service or a resource in a market are the demanders. So what exactly is meant by demand then? Demand has a very simple definition in economics. It is simply the willingness and the ability to buy a good at a range of prices. While our definition refers to goods, demand could also be for resources or services as well. But generally speaking, the demand for anything requires that the buyer is willing and able to buy that thing at a range of particular prices. So this brings us to the law of demand. This basic economic principle states that there is always an inverse relationship between the price of a good and the quantity demanded. Basically what this means is that when the price of a good is high, a lower quantity will be demanded by the buyers of that good. Vice versa, when the price of a good is low, a greater quantity will be demanded. With this law of demand in mind, we have what we need to draw a demand curve. The demand curve simply illustrates this law of demand. It shows the relationship between the price of a good, which we will draw on the vertical axis, I'll call this axis P for price, and the quantity of the good demanded, for which I will use QD. The x-axis or horizontal axis in a demand curve diagram will always be labeled QD. So for illustration's sake, we're going to look at the market for ice cream today. Let's hypothetically assume that the price of ice cream is very high at $8 per scoop. So I'll put a point up here at $8. At a price of $8 per scoop, it's reasonable to assume that a very low quantity of ice cream will be demanded. The reason for this is that there are very few consumers who are both willing and able to buy ice cream for $8 per scoop. The benefit that consumers derive from a single scoop of ice cream is simply not worth the cost of $8 for a single scoop. For this reason, we can assume that the quantity demanded at $8 will be relatively low. I'll put a point here at 100 scoops. But what happens when the price of ice cream falls? At lower prices, there will be more consumers who are willing and able to buy ice cream, because more consumers will believe that the benefit derived from the ice cream is worth the lower price that they have to pay. So at a lower price of, say, $7, it's perfectly reasonable to assume that a greater quantity of ice cream will be demanded. Let's assume that the quantity demanded at $7 has doubled to 200 scoops. So this line of reasoning shall continue. We'll see that as the price of ice cream falls from $8 to $7 to $6 to $5 and so on, more and more consumers will become willing and able to buy ice cream. At lower prices, a greater number of consumers find that they are willing and able to afford the scoops of ice cream. Therefore, the demand curve for ice cream will be inversely related to the price of a scoop of ice cream. We can see that demand is downward sloping for ice cream. So what we have just done is drawn our first demand curve. This is simply a downward sloping line showing the inverse relationship between the price of ice cream per scoop and the quantity of scoops demanded by consumers. The reason for the downward sloping demand curve is that at higher prices, fewer consumers are willing and able to buy ice cream. They simply do not believe that the benefit they will derive from a single scoop of ice cream is worth the higher prices being charged for ice cream. However, at lower prices, as the price of ice cream decreases, as price decreases, the quantity demanded increases. And this is because more consumers are both willing and able to buy ice cream at lower prices. So that's basically the demand curve. We have defined demand as simply the willingness and the ability to buy a good at a range of prices. The demand curve illustrates this fundamental economic concept of the law of demand, which states that ceteris paribus, or assuming nothing else changes, there is always an inverse relationship between the price of a good and the quantity demanded. We could apply the law of demand to other goods besides ice cream, or even resources like labor, such as teachers or doctors. At higher wage rates, schools will wish to employ fewer teachers, but at lower wage rates, schools find that the benefit of employing a teacher is greater than the additional cost of hiring that teacher, so a greater number of teachers will be employed. The same is true for any good, service, or resource. There should always be an inverse relationship between the price of a good and the quantity that buyers of that good will demand at a range of prices.